appreciation, of course, to Dr. Volf for both of his lectures, and I will be drawing at least somewhat upon both. I generally find very many resonances to my own convictions in his work, and this time I would like especially to highlight his emphasis on the transcendent for understanding genuinely human flourishing. It seems to me that too much recent Christian theology has been subject to a sort of pendulum swing from being, as they used to say, so heavenly minded that it was no earthly good, to being so earthly minded that it has sacrificed the heavenly resources that are critical even to legitimate earthly goals. Apart from the transcendent and indeed the eschatological, how shall we fund truly self-sacrificial action on behalf of others, especially over the long haul? Where will we find resources for lives, even the lives of the most privileged among us, that in a broken world are riddled with genuine suffering? Grateful as we may be for, say, aspects of positive psychology and myriad other secular efforts, taken alone, they risk leaving us trapped in the paradox of hedonism, which Dr. Volf so eloquently concluded his lecture with, the paradox of moralism, or both. To have purpose and meaning, lives require a reference point beyond themselves. And we may be glad insofar as world religions affirm this point, as Dr. Volf has said. Well, the default beginning point for a Reformed theologian like me in discussing world faiths in their various forms and impacts is probably a reference to common grace. So lest I be accused of neglecting so obvious a matter, I'll offer at least the requisite few words on this genuinely important affirmation. Surely it is both biblical and simply honest to acknowledge that the God who makes his rain to fall upon the just and the unjust gives good gifts, genuinely good gifts to all people. That these gifts have classically, and also by me, been understood as not being in themselves salvific does not mean that they are not good, even as the Apostle Paul could speak of the law that cannot save us as holy and just and good. Very many times, non-Christians put Christians to shame across any spectrum of attributes a person might wish to select. And at the intellectual level, perhaps the arenas in which world faiths find substantive or even merely formal agreement may be seen by Christians as manifestations of common grace, even if they might be labeled differently by adherents of these other faiths. At the same time, failure, sin, and error are rampant in all traditions. And any who exempt their own tradition from that judgment are dangerous to themselves and others. I was talking with a theologically sophisticated Christian friend the other day who has been tutoring a mature Buddhist monk in English. She was surprised at the amount of fear associated with sensitivities to numbers and mirrors and physical orientation and the various dictates of feng shui, the deep sense of threat of demonic forces. Not quite the sort of thing we generally have in mind when we are wanting, say, to fix up our homes to market them to a particular constituency. Sometimes we focus too exclusively on the benign in others, as well as, or especially, in ourselves, a matter to which I shall return. Apart from that, though, another particular difficulty from my perspective is that the major faiths have a wholeness to them, and that at the down-to-earth level, what makes the difference in the behavior of believers is not beliefs held in the abstract so much as the daily practices that shape their lives, on which Dr. Volf has written elsewhere, and the passions, fears, and desires for power that Dr. Laverton highlighted yesterday. Thus, it's not especially difficult to affirm, let us say, a principle of good stewardship. But it is very difficult indeed to make radical lifestyle changes enabling one to contribute generously to others and to care better for a dying planet. I'm even wondering if the breakdown of denominational affiliations in our own context might be increasing local rather than broader, much less global, attachments and reference points. We get to be concerned just about ourselves. Implicit in these comments is a question as to whether the commonalities of world faiths Dr. Volf has laid out so skillfully come at too high a level of abstraction to gain practical traction. Still, can a major faith or major faiths make a positive difference in the public arena? The evidence is yes. A couple of years ago, political scientist Robert Woodbury, son of our own Dudley Woodbury, published an exhaustively documented study backed by the most sophisticated sorts of statistical analysis in the premier secular journal in this field, the American Political Science Review, showing an astonishingly robust relationship between what he called conversionary Protestant missionary activity, as contrasted with state-sponsored Protestant Christian groups, and with Roman Catholics, Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhist missions, and the evolution of specifically democratic forms of government in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Oceania, as well as Europe and America. Such a development was fostered by these missionaries' promotion of religious liberty, mass education, especially including women, mass printing, including of newspapers, and colonial reforms. And it resulted in the increase in the rule of law and an expansion of the middle class. Woodbury's analysis covered the 19th through mid-20th centuries, and he acknowledges that other religious groups have, to a considerable extent, taken up the mantle since that time. But the point is that religiously motivated endeavors, sometimes as a result of their quite distinct theological convictions, can indeed make truly dramatic differences at the level of ordinary, this-worldly human flourishing, even when they're aiming primarily at another world. So far, so good. But then intrudes this nasty, ongoing reality of sin, individual and corporate, radical, deep, and intransigent. Poet W.H. Auden's literary executor, Edward Mendelsohn, comments on Auden, who was a Christian of a not altogether orthodox sort, asking himself why it was that in committing to a religious tradition, he chose to follow Jesus rather than Socrates or Buddha or Confucius or Muhammad. Auden responded to his own question, "None of the others arouse all sides of my being to cry out, 'Crucify him.'" Something, it seems, was more radical about Jesus, something that brought out what was wrong with Auden himself at a compelling, disconcerting level. Also something that got Jesus and can still get his followers in a good deal of trouble that doesn't, on the face of it, look much at all like flourishing. Yet Auden wasn't looking just for flourishing in this ordinary sense. The sense that Volf has pointed out is such a salient temptation. He knew something of suffering, of evil, of the sin that lurked not just within others, but also within him. So he didn't espouse, say, a safe and abstract love of neighbor, readily affirmed by those of goodwill, despite his earlier hopeful political activism. In fact, in the face of the horrors he saw around him and in himself, he gave up his optimism about the eventual evolution of a just and loving society. But he didn't give up his faith. The way he expressed it later, toward the end of the poem, As I Walked Out One Evening, which begins by professing love in a deliberately idealized, even cliched way, was, "You shall love your crooked neighbor with your crooked heart." It is, I think, a distinctively Christian imperative, one shaped to withstand many disappointed hopes of moral progress.
Thank you, Dr. Volf. I want to speak a little bit on, and I even put a title on my little speech, The Human Flourishing I Never Knew. I'd like to begin by saying that in principle, I agree with your idea or your project of world religions coming together and helping to create a just society. The concept of globalization, however, it's, as you said, a bit difficult to swallow coming from ICOM. And it seems to be that in the context in which I grew up, I'm from Honduras, and if you understand the concept of the banana republic, Honduras is the quintessential banana republic. I'm later on calling myself a banana republic theologian. My dad used to work for the Chiquita Banana. You can understand that the whole history of globalization that happened in my country and how politics, economics, religion all play a big role. It does impact the way I see and I inspect the idea of globalization. So the intersection of faith, politics, economics, and human flourishing in my context has tragic ongoing connotations. To begin with, the birth of Las Americas was a colonial project that utilized the proclamation of Jesus Christ to legitimize the Iberian dream, the flourishing of an empire. It accomplished it through a campaign of military occupation, cultural devastation, the appropriation of the land, colonization, massacring, and Christianizing and civilizing the savages of the New World. The worst consequence of colonialism in my context, however, was not material, but symbolic. An infamous colonial script was originated in the psyche of the Americas under three notions. One, suffering is a God-given historical reality and inevitable in the processes of colonization and civilization. Two, Christ illustrates suffering and even invites it. Three, God blesses the other in power and allows him to use violence to accomplish his divine mandate. So this colonial script is the result of the projection of a theopolitical epistemic code by which most Latin Americans would eventually come to understand their own history, their own identity, and their political protagonism in terms of being an accessory to Western imperial powers. Naturally, the logic of colonialism has stimulated a history of resistance and kind of a diversion in the continent, which has been consistently overpowered by Western hegemonic forces in the political, economic, and also academic arena. On the other side of the Atlantic, in Europe, the logic of colonialism and the rhetoric of modernity will be justified and promoted in the following way. Since European colonies have remained in the shadows of the Renaissance, Enlightenment, and modern civilization, and modernity, and such historical periods form the foundations of modern civilization, scientific knowledge, political independence, and economic progress, apart from socio-religious stability. It is to the utmost advantage of all societies, regardless of their locations, ethnicities, and races, that these colonies and their natives be nurtured with the seed of Western heritage so that we all can flourish, a universal vision of flourishing. In this way, the dominant powers of the West came to operate under an imperial colonial core codified by an internal logic we call colonialism and a rhetoric we may call modernity. The former, colonialism, sought to control knowledge, race, and capital. The latter fabricated its own myth, namely that modernity was a Western independent autonomous phenomenon that positioned Europe far ahead and above the rest of the world, making it the seat of human history and progress. At play here is the logic of coloniality and the legitimation of the politics of imperial domination. If Amerindians, for instance, were not as humanly valuable as the Europeans, then violent colonial processes such as deicide, the killing of their gods, ethnocide, the killing of their ethnic value, and genocide, massacres, can be properly justified for the sake of Europe's historical development. Natives in the Americas became imperial accessories. Hence, Enrique Dussel, the Argentinian philosopher and historian, properly argues that the Cartesian logic of the European modernity, early European modernity, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, presupposes the colonial logic of the Americas. Ego conquiro, ego cogito. I conquer, therefore I think. Put bluntly, without the conquest of the Americas and the logic of colonialism, there is no enlightenment, modernity, and Europe as we have come to know them. Said differently, there would be no human flourishing as Westerners define it if were not for the gold, the goods, and the human labor of the European colonies. So perhaps some sort of modernity did happen in the Americas after all, in the form of coloniality as the first project of early modernity. It would be nice to say that things significantly changed in the Americas with introduction of Protestantism in the 19th century, but that would be another myth. In fact, Protestantism weakened significantly the influence of Iberian Catholicism over civic and political life, but at the expense of facilitating the layers of knowledge and power that would yoke Latin America to a new superpower. And now I'm talking about the United States of America. To be fair, Latin America was never colonized by the United States, at least not in the former European way. But it was occidentalized. It was neo-colonized, which refers to a sophisticated cultural and epistemic occupation of the Latin American cultural and epistemic code with significant economic, political, and religious ramifications, my country being one exhibit. Let's take, for instance, the God Bless America political project. Whose flourishing do we think it is implied in this nice phrase that we usually recite, and who's paying for it? We're talking about one nation that subsumes the symbolic power of a whole continent in one name, one politics, one economy, one religion, and one dream of human flourishing. Consequently, historical projects such as Pan-Americanism, civilizing Protestant missions, and the doctrine of economic development were all part of an epistemic layer that staged the process of occidentalization of the continent. By the way, that's the name I'm giving to globalization, occidentalization. It's the way we're perceiving it over there. I heard an African brother who said that what we call in the West globalization, they call it over there Americanization. So it takes different names once it gets out of our place. Summing up, human flourishing, where I come from, has two big names: the Iberian dream and the American dream, none of which is about what Jose Martí, the Cuban poet and independentist, called our America, nuestra America. So how to envision a human flourishing in our America? And I think that your presentation, in a way, affects this in a positive way. Number one, I would say that it is important to be able to produce our own knowledge. It's an epistemological project. We must begin to think our own thoughts, even if hegemonic traditions of the West tell us that the best thinking happens in the West. We must begin to exercise what is known as epistemic decolonization and the affirmation of indigenous traditions and bodies of knowledge previously negated to Western traditions and neglecting historiographies. That's number one. Number two, we must think hemispherically and not geopolitically. We must embrace transnationality as a continental condition, and that's probably the positive action toward globalization. Transnationality as a continental condition, and locality as an strategic organization for the negotiation of identities, histories, spaces, and institutions. For instance, the Global South in partnership with the South in the Global North. Latin Americans in the diaspora, Nigerians with Nigerians in Europe and the US, etc. Together, in a way, challenging and destabilizing imperial courts embedded in global economies and external policies that are not really helping the good living that we all want. Number three, we must re-theologize the church, and talking about the church of the Americas, and forge a decolonial grammar endowed with a Trinitarian ethics of liberation, able to reconfigure the social DNA of churches and their social witness. And finally, we must reimagine intercultural, interreligious life in terms of world and hemispheric conversations. For Christians, and in support of what you're saying, this might mean remembering how to speak pre-Constantinianly or post-Constantinianly, except in a multicultural, polycentric, polyphonic, and pluriversal. I love to speak of different universes because every context has their own universes. So we're really in front of a pluriversal environment that will be, I think, willing to engage a praxis of the good living as long as one doesn't impose that vision on the other. Thank you very much.
So first, I want to thank Dr. Volf for his thorough and stimulating discussions. I'll start out by saying that we are shaped by our contexts and experiences, and by the way in which we share the space we call the globe. There are various models of shared space and sharing. I see Miroslav's articulation as a proposal for how we share space within the global community. In his proposal, I see the concern to respect others, and in his delineation of the characteristics of the world religions, I see a proposal for the possibility of positive, transformative influence of the world religions. I frame my response with two perspectives, each offering a vantage point on globalization and the awareness of shared space. The first vantage point is that of Psalms 8. For globalization and flourishing is about honoring God's creation and human beings as a part of that created order. So when I look at your heavens, the work of your hands, the moon and the stars that you have established, what are human beings that you are mindful of them, mortals, that you care for them? Yet you have made them a little lower than God and crowned them with glory and honor. You have given them dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under their feet. This conveys the equality and dignity of human beings, as well as a shared responsibility to care for God's creation. The second image is an attempt to deal with ordinary life. That is, at the point of tension between being disadvantaged and having the opportunity for living well. For while we can thrive without necessities, the absence of them redefines our understanding of flourishing and life itself. I am reminded of the poem by Emma Lazarus. You know it well. In the lines, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore, send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." With these words etched on the Statue of Liberty, this has become an American symbol of hope for many and a shining light in a world marred by diminished dreams. It is the symbol of globalization, hope for the marginalized, poor from nations around the world. It is a symbol of the possibility of human flourishing, actualized in present life rather than deferred for another dimension. Miroslav identifies two components of flourishing: life being lived well, namely loving God and neighbor, fearing God, being righteous, and life going well, feeding the poor, healing the sick, and abundant possession. He proposes that these two components are present in all world religions. I wonder out loud with you today about the symbol that we, privileged 21st century Christians, embrace. What do we consider as flourishing within this shared global context? Do we allow love all as you love yourself to take root in our heart and lives? Do we dare see in the tired, poor, homeless ourselves? They, like us, created and bearing the God image. I am concerned that in our attempt to live life well, we may distort loving God and neighbor, and thus see much of the world's population as other. I shudder to think that we participate in what Miroslav calls failures of practices. That is, that we continue to see the world as ours and God's in ways that mistakenly attempt to evangelize the world to become like us, while seeing the rest of the world as other, different, less worthy, less than God intended, and even in the not-so-secret parts of our mind, less than us, and therefore less human. Flourishing begins in our view of ourselves in relation to God. For as long as we nourish the divide between us and them, we fail to embrace the fact that we are one. We are them, and they are us. And we embark not on healthy principles of globalization, but on the tragedy of colonialism, dressed in religious armor with the Bible as our weapon of choice. Love compels us to be transformed through the renewing of our minds. Our belief in God the Creator demands us to comprehend that we are part of the global community. Flourishing means that we are our brothers and sisters' keeper, that we are our children's protectors. We stand with our brothers and sisters. We bear each other's burdens. We have somehow succumbed to the notion that flourishing begins when all of our needs are satisfied, or when we have overcome our struggles. we mistaken our desires for our needs. The suffering and the marginalized people of the world within our global community teach us that flourishing begins in the human heart and spirit. Flourishing is like grass beneath a rock that grows in spite of the odds, across religious lines, political lines, ethnic lines. It is the God-given human spirit that must and does seek to survive. Flourishing has various faces and shapes, but one core, the audacity to live and to embrace more of life, to realize that there is indeed more to life than what any of us alone or together can imagine. But to flourish, we must imagine, or we run the risk of limiting ourselves and the community to the tiny speck of wants and needs we experience. Not bread alone, but the grasp for power and the cost of human life in maintaining that power. We need new experiences and vantage points on the world. Otherwise, what we imagine for the future will be only a redressed version of what we are living or have lived in the past. We replicate ourselves, and in so doing, also replicate the impediments to sharing space on this planet. Positive globalization and flourishing are opportunities for a more holistic mode of sharing global community space. One of the more startling displays of impediments to flourishing is sexism, fostered by religious beliefs and manifested in limited opportunities for women. Another is the weird notion that gender and skin color determines intelligence and ability. And yet another is the idea that one's ability to speak English is the measure of intelligence and ability. These misguided notions are distortions and impediment to healthy globalization and flourishing. Globalization happens and will continue by virtue of religion, technology, and commerce. Flourishing by itself does not indicate presence of good, nor does globalization indicate good practices. Both globalization and flourishing happen, both with and without right living. Right living does not guarantee material flourishing. Both good and evil may flourish. And the religions have ways of dealing with that tension. We are in the midst of the tension, juxtaposed between the image of Psalm 1, the godly prospering, and the image of Psalm 37, the reality of evil prospering. The contentious inquiry, why do the wicked prosper, is another part of that tension. Technology does not transcend religion and perhaps manifests many of the same characteristics typically associated with the world religions. Technology, media in particular, has permitted a window into the world of opulent lifestyles, illustrating the gap between the privileged and the underprivileged. By providing a view into the various parts of our shared space, media displays how we as humans have used our entrusted ability to care for each other and the world. Thriving may mean surviving against the odds. Waiting is a part of the cultural and religious perspective, teaching people to wait. Even so, waiting is a manifestation of status. It would appear that privilege is least content with waiting, while underprivileged and disadvantaged must have the tolerance for waiting as an essential part of hope and survival. Thank you.
Thank you. Those are very, very rich responses, and to respond to each one of them, I have to ponder have time to ponder a bit longer than I have here. So what I'll try to do is kind of pick out only a few aspects from each of the responders, and then say a few comments, and wherever discussion goes from there. Let me start in the backwards order or forwards order, returning back to where it started, starting from Dr. Jacobs to García-Johnson and then Shuster. I really like to comment about waiting. I have thought a lot about waiting and the importance of waiting. Importance of waiting not simply as an expression of impotence, but importance of waiting as an expression of respect for the other. Of what you cannot make the other do, you have to wait for them to do. Right? It's a sense of powerlessness, but also, even if you are powerful, the significance of waiting, which is an expression of respect. And I would wish that in the Christian tradition we were more at home with what seems to have been early on one of the signature stances of early Christians, namely waiting for the Messiah to return. Waiting doesn't mean doing nothing, but waiting means, in a significant sense, realizing that the outcomes are not in our hands. And given the complexities of globalization processes, and given kind of entrenched character of both the kind of mixture of goodness and evil within religions and in globalization as a whole, I think that may be a good posture. Another comment that I liked very much is the transformation that begins and the power of flourishing that begins very deep in the recesses of one's heart, that grass that grows under the rock. That seemed to me also very, very important. Also, the flourishing, the concept of flourishing, I think, do we have, if I understood correctly, are we able to think of flourishing not simply with regard to ourselves, but with regard to all of human beings? Are we able to do so in a way that embraces and practices equality across gender, racial, and other lines? Are we able to do more than just practice it with equality, but also with a kind of solidarity that wants the good of the other as one wants one's own good? And I think maybe that's also a good nudge for us to think how flourishing is understood. We often think of it in individual terms, my own personal flourishing, and then of course we think about conditions that are necessary from the outside. But it's a good question to ask whether that's a good way to think about it. And I was startled by a phrase in the New Testament. And it came first to me when I was thinking about kind of eschatology. And the phrase is, and then was kind of highlighted in a conference that we had where Marianne was present as well, on joy. It's a phrase that in one of the parables, the master said, "Enter into joy of your master." Now, entering into joy is not become happy, or you're going to get this stuff and then you're going to be happy. But you enter into joy is entering into the space of rejoicing that is a shared and common space that has, I think, from the eschatological perspective, kind of certain universal, I don't want to go into debate about universalism now, but however construed particularist or universalist eschatology, certain universal scope, namely all who are there participate in a state which is marked by joy, and our participation is just participation in that. That seemed to me a very important dimension of our experience of flourishing, the communal side of things. García-Johnson, there's a lot there that I would we would need to discuss, figure out for me to understand also better. Let me just make a few comments about, so way I understand, so what I try to do in the chapters of this project that I have not shared with you or with the responders, which is kind of not fair thing to do at all. But what I try to do, especially in chapter 1 on globalization, I emphasize the ambivalence of globalization processes, just like as between lines, I have emphasized ambivalence of religions here. Religions are ambivalent phenomena. When I was teaching this course, we started the course, we started the course by looking at 9/11 and the Jubilee Initiative, right? And you have in 9/11 and Jubilee Initiative illustrated the ambivalence of religions, right? And especially, I'm not, so I think the same way of globalization processes, and especially, I'm very much not in favor of looking at history in kind of progressivist kinds of ways. I don't think history is progressing. I don't think there's progress, actually. But there are varieties of progresses as there are varieties of digresses as well. And so I have maybe overly pessimistic. I'm Eastern European. That's my excuse for all my pessimism, right? But I have a kaleidoscopic view of history. It's almost like things shift and change. That there are things that are there, but they take different configurations. Some things go up, the other things go down. And you can't quite say that we have actually, as a kind of humanity, made progress. So I want to kind of push against this. And especially, I want to think about the progress, on whose backs is progress made? Right? And if you look at the history of globalization, colonialization as well, then you suddenly realize that this reflection that Walter Benjamin had on the progress on history, right? You've got the progress and the wind of desire blows into the wings of that Angelus Novus, but behind him remains, the angel remains, kind of ruined landscapes, ruined lives. And if you just have a little bit of pessimism of the European kind, or if you look a little bit realistically onto history, you realize how much destruction occurs in the progress of history, and all those lives that have been lost. Every single one was as precious in the life, in the eyes of God, as life of any one of us alive today. It's often hard for us to imagine that. It's hard for us to mourn the loss of previous generations. But this is also my hope for the eschatological judgment of God, that these lives have not been lost, that its lives will encounter justice, justice of a rightful judge in the context of reconciliation too. I don't think, for instance, globalization is also identical with Americanization. It might have been in the given phases. I think increasingly currents are going in multiple directions. India, especially, with China, but other areas as well. Still, there is a kind of dominant, obviously, thrust here, and institutions, in particular, world institutions, global institutions, are imbalanced. But in terms of cultural exchanges, we're seeing things go the other way. At least I would wish them to be so. I don't particularly think that globalization is well conceived if it's understood simply from a center going to the periphery. And this would be also, I think, at least Christian criticism of any such type of globalization where it ends up being something like McDonaldization. And it can be that because the church from the beginning speaks in many languages, as my colleague Lamin Sane from Ghana has emphasized. I think in terms of God Bless America and what kind of effects it has had, I see American Project as a very ambivalent project. I see John Winthrop, for instance, Massachusetts Bay Colony, as deeply problematic experiment. My hero is Roger Williams. Those are kind of my sensibilities, but for life of me, I say that sometimes, and people kind of maybe take kind of mental offense at it. But I think that Massachusetts Bay was a kind of a Taliban state. If you compare what Taliban do now in extreme areas, this is what was done in Massachusetts Bay. And I think that's not such good news. That's part and parcel of the ambivalence, so that the city shining on the hill, John Winthrop's that metaphor, kind of rested on the heavy hand of the state, making sure that the obedience is done to God's laws, so that blessings can be had. I think that's deeply problematic. I think that's deeply unchristian. I think we need to go as quickly in our imagination away from this as we possibly can, and I'm hoping the globalization processes are in fact helping us to do so. I think there is something like a legitimate form of proper affection for one's own country, for one's own nation, as one among many nations. And in that sense, the form of, I'm not opposed to forms of self-love. There's a special affection to particular religious communities that we have. That's also a form of other love combined with self-love. Mark has yesterday spoken about how that we should watch how we speak about the church, who is the bride of Christ, right? There's a certain affection that's appropriate to it without it being prideful. The same true is also of other nations, but that's not to say that Christian faith, other religious traditions aren't forming fundamentally transnational communities, and to the degree that they get identified with a particular nation, they are betraying their original vision. As to Dr. Schuster's response, I agree with much of what she had said, and that beautiful quote from Auden, "You shall love your crooked neighbor with your crooked heart," is such a vintage Christian statement that's amazingly apt, right? Because that's really what, from the Christian standpoint, it is all about. Self-awareness of one's own sinfulness, and just on account of that, ability to not just recognize the sinfulness of others, but love them notwithstanding and within their own sinfulness themselves. So that seems to me hugely important, and I think it also applies to kind of this ambivalence of good and evil in religions, including in our own Christian tradition. And maybe I should say that, as you know, I've been involved in dialogues with Islam, and one of the things that we have done when we crafted a response, which is called ended up being Yale response to the Common Word, is one of the first things we did. We repented publicly, or apologized to the Muslims for what, in the course of the evils that have been committed against Muslims in the Crusades. Apology was there not in its literal sense, but we, in a way, express sorrow for what those connected with us have done to predecessors of some of the Muslims in the past, today's Muslims in the past. And we've gotten all sorts of grief for that. Why do you apologize? Have they apologized to you? I think we apologize because we have capacity to recognize that we are sinning. And we apologize not because they've apologized, as if you're bartering with apologies here. If you apologize that much, I'm going to apologize that much. But because we know that what our responses to others in terms of our moral behavior are not reactive, but they are out of the inside and the crookedness of our own heart and confession of that, and just that makes us able to love those whose hearts also are crooked.
Thank you. Thank you. At this time, if you have questions, please come to the mic. But as you come, please let me remind you, we are time sensitive. Keep your explanation to 15 seconds and your question to 15 seconds, and we can get more questions in. So please come.
My question is to Dr. Volf that, in a sense, you identify certain common dispositions or aspiration of world religions, especially identifying that, that connectivity, transcendence is something that world religions share. But my question is really whether that's existential, in a sense, reductionism of religions, because religions touches the comprehensive dimension of a human life. It itself is a plausibility structure. So when religions become globalized or globalized dispositions, it creates certain particular form of civilization. So my question, form of what? Civilization. Yeah, that's why we have a different, world civilization. So my question is whether each religion has a different theology or sociology or implied sociology together with anthropology, Not, let alone, theology. And what's the implication? Because that's exactly why certain religions, as you mentioned, Max Weber.
Dr. Lee.
Yes, give rise to, particular form of, society, democracy, respect for the human dignity. Other religions still struggling. Yeah. So I want to hear about your theological sociology.
Yeah, I do agree that different religions with different accounts of transcendence, they have different accounts of transcendence. That's our struggle, right? Say Islam, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, partly Judaism. Among these, we have different conceptions of transcendence. Connected with that, we have different conceptions of how transcendence relates to mundane realities. We have different conceptions of who the self, what the self is, what the proper relation of the self to others is. So all of these issues, when I squinted and described these common features, I did not in any way want to disregard profound differences that exist. But as we think about profound differences, let's not forget about commonalities as well. And let's not forget about how even in these varied accounts of transcendence, that there is an internal differentiation in those traditions, so that sometimes traditions among themselves are within tradition, you have larger distances than across traditions, if you look at carefully at things. And I think we also let this play itself out in an ad hoc basis, rather than making kind of generalized statements about religion. Do I agree with particular, so the Christians agree with a particular stance on human dignity of Buddhists? I will ask which Christians, which Buddhists would that be? Within the framework of their own faiths, there are different possibilities are capable, but I think we have this common frame, right, which is, I think, significant as a way of discussing, as a way of accessing, deepening in some ways our connection to our respective traditions and continuing to really argue. I think this is, witness and argue.
Thank you. We will receive these last 4 questions and then we will end. Yes.
Thank you so much for the discussion. Something that's been on the back of my mind as we have been talking about the transcendent and mundane realm, human flourishing, and yesterday's comment with you, Dr. Volf, on religion having people pull out as individuals from their context, if I got that right. I've been thinking about the Jesus movements that have been occurring around the world, where we have brothers and sisters coming to follow Jesus, but staying within their socio-religious, cultural context. So, as we have Muslims, who are becoming followers of Jesus, but staying in the mosque. So, how does that, what you have been talking about, how does that work in with the Jesus movements?
Yeah, that's a very good and interesting example. And as you know, there is just debate within the Christian theology, missionary circles, and other circles, the extent to which this is an appropriate embrace of following Jesus when there is no break. You're not called out of anything. That's can be a simple argument, right, that people make. You can be the church, you can be the follower of Christ. I think the situation is much more complex, and we ought to reflect carefully of what kind of implications for leaving a particular environment does our ultimate allegiance to Jesus Christ have. But my sense would be, unless there is ultimate allegiance to Jesus Christ, and therefore always already the break to everything else taking place, the genuine Christian faith is not actually there. So the genuineness of Christian faith seems to me to depend on the Lordship of Jesus Christ. Now, what that Lordship would concretely mean, to what degree I can do what I continue to do, to what degree I can change, what do I have to leave, and what do I have to have to or can continue doing, I think those will be then decisions to be made. It's a decision about sanctification, if you put it in this way, not a decision about the beginnings, about the call and appeal to an individual and their conscience. So in some ways, you could stay very much rooted within and still embody the character of the world faith, in this case, the character of the Christian faith. Maybe other faiths might have a different stances on this, and obviously different Christians have different stances on it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I've got a question. So I like what you said about how various religious movements try to use politics to kind of solidify their positions of power. I guess my question would be, what would you say to, for example, in America, someone who is a member of maybe the religious right, who says, the reason why my organization is, suing the government over, the Affordable Care Act or something, is because we're afraid of government, of politics encroaching on religion. Because most of them, from my experience, they see their political activity as a matter of freedom of conscience. That's what they frame it.
Yeah, of course, the religious right has kind of gone through various incarnations, right? And there are various representatives there. I take it, as I saw it, my comments referred primarily to those who would think that the ultimate goal, whatever immediate goals might be, is somehow to retrieve back the Christian America, America as a Christian nation. That to me is the problematic goal. I don't think nations are Christian. I think communities, ecclesial communities are Christian. I think persons are Christian, but not nations. Again, that's contested, I realize. And then I would say what I advocate is not withdrawal from political engagement. Certainly, Christians, just like everybody else, has the right to speak in their own voice in public realm, to advocate for their own values. But the goal is not to kind of make a Christian America a Christian nation. The goal is to have values of the Christian faith shape the culture and social mores of a particular country. I don't think there's any problem with that. I take it that that's the heart of democracy, right? Everybody does that. I hope secularists will do that. I hope Muslims will do that as well. And I think the central issue is, are we pluralistic enough to recognize that the same right that we take for ourselves, we ought to grant to others, or in some of the more secularized countries, are we witnessing certain form of secular exclusivism that shuts out the religious voices from the public space because they are allegedly violent or whatever it is. Engagement on equal terms in public realm, yes. Reconquering countries as nations of a particular religious group, absolutely not.
Thank you.
My question was along the same lines, so I'm going to kind of rephrase it. But you've talked about this phrase of giving up the dream of controlling public life. And I think that you used a term today that I heard before is unreligionist versus religionist. And so that's... Yeah, so I would generally say atheist. And then most of the people I've had this conversation with would...
Question, please. Question.
Yeah,
Question.
The question is, as you have this idea of Christians controlling public life, you do have these very outspoken other groups that you would call non-religionists that do seem to want to fill that space. And so I think there's a fear that you would, as you give up this ability to have dialogue, that you would lose. And I think that's what I hear a lot of people...
Question.
That's the question, is how do you negate that? Or how do you take those risks? How do you propose that we actually lose a little bit of our power or our control in order to find that voice with others and not have the fear?
Well, I'm not sure exactly how I propose for us not to have fear. We've got to deal with our fears, right? But I'm hopeful that fearing God would make us not fear so much each other. I'm hoping that allegiance to transcendent goals will relativize our investments in mundane realities. My sense is, various other groups. I don't need to. I'm not ceding space, right? It's not a war. It's golden rule applied to political situation, which obviously will be then carried out in conflictual terms. But it's not if I'm not letting Muslims speak, for instance. Who's there to be letting? I have an obligation, moral obligation, to grant them equal rights as I have, and therefore I'm not letting them. I'm respecting the inherent dignity of these people, inherent dignity as well of atheists, sometimes militant atheists. I think that just a footnote on militant atheism. I think the kind of Christianity that we've had maybe deserves the kind of inane militant atheism that we got.
Mercy. Amen. Thank you. Last question.
Dr. Volf, you've been talking a lot about transcendence, and especially in your personal testimony last night when one of the respondents asked what you thought this generation might be missing. You said transcendence of God. And in your first lecture, you made a correlation between the transcendence of God and prophetism. Can you clarify what you meant by that? You talked about asceticism in the individual life, and then you talked about prophetism and how it plays a role in transcendence. Because I represent a part of the world where we are not seeing an increase in religions, we're seeing an increase in totalized secularization up in Canada. So we're losing 65% of our church a year. So what would you say is the role between prophetism and transcendence in restoring, say, the free church?
Right. First, I suppose once, if it's true that let's talk about Christianity. I can maybe it's easy. If it's true that Christianity works with a kind of two worlds account of reality, and I think the conviction about creation ex nihilo, that God created the world out of nothing, is probably the strongest affirmation of two worlds, quote unquote, worlds account of reality. Right? But then if you give precedence to the transcendent realm over the mundane realm, and you have to if you believe in God creating the world, then the transcendent realm, then God has claims upon our lives, and God has claims upon ordering of earthly realities, upon my own life, as well as upon the life of human beings as whole. And so we engage then both in personal sanctification, if you want, that might be the ascetic strand of things, or asceticism may be one form in which attention to personal holiness may be practiced. And then we engage in something like social holiness and transformation. And then we ask ourselves, which concerns society, culture, its structures, its legal provision. And then we ask ourselves, what is an appropriate way to engage in the project of aligning the world with the purposes of God? And I think my basic rule there is you shouldn't subvert by means that which you seek to achieve as your goal, right? Means can't contradict the end. Means are, in a Christian way of thinking, means are ends. And they are not just means to achieve something which you can kind of discard as if nothing had happened, because the goal was significant. And if you put things in those terms, then it puts you have both encouragement in order to shape worldly realities, but you have also a check. And check that comes not because somebody is pushing from outside and you're unable to do what otherwise you would do, but check that comes from within, that is itself a form of faithfulness to exactly the transcendence that gives you mandate to start the transforming process in the first place.
Thank you. Please, again, thank our respondents.